Happy Tuesday. So I saw some of you dancing. I'm Emiliana Guareca, otherwise known as Emmy. I am the Executive Director of Women's March Action and resident DJ. So I will take some requests if you want to put it in the chat. We have a fantastic conversation coming your way, but I do want to introduce my team today. I have Sofia de Loreto Chari, who is our campaigns manager, our communication manager, James Clark. We also have Joanne Smith, our super digital coordinator. So I want to say hi to everyone, and I am going to ask you to put in the chat what you are drinking. This is People, Politics, and Drinks. I am currently drinking sparkling water, pumpkin spice latte earlier. If you are a pumpkin spice person, put it in the chat. Tell me where you're joining from and say hello. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sophia. Sophia?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We have more people joining, which is awesome. We're going to let people file in before we get our speaker started. I have launched a poll for you guys. So if you could take the time to just answer those quick questions, I can get a sense of where you guys all are calling in from, how you're feeling, what you're drinking. I put the kombucha question on there for Emmy. She's always drinking kombucha. I don't know if any of you guys are, but I wanted to make sure we hit all our bases here with everybody. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. We are moving closer to election day, like, well, truly every day. And so these conversations get ever more important, especially with what's been going on. Things that are distracting us from the election, things that we can't avoid talking about. I wanted to give you guys also just a quick reminder of how this all works. So we'll bring our speaker on. You'll be able to, they'll speak for just a couple minutes, and then we will open it up to Q&A, so you'll be able to ask your questions. You can raise your hand virtually by clicking on participants. And then in the bottom right-hand corner of the little window that pops up, you have the option to raise your hand virtually. If that doesn't work, you can go ahead and just like wave at us frantically until we see you. Throughout the conversation, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat, and we can either, if you want, we can ask them for you, but otherwise we will definitely just unmute you so you can ask them yourself. So again, thank you so much for being here. And I do want to remind you really quickly that the election is super close and that we are doing a ton of work for the election as we move closer to November. I would love to see you guys on some of our volunteer opportunities. We just finished up a text bank where we texted 300,000 college-educated women in 3 of the most critical swing states for the presidential election. So if that's something that you're interested in, I would love to see you there. You can check out the follow-up email that we'll be sending with links to get involved and help us out with these unique campaigns. I'm gonna assume most of you have filled out the poll by now. If you haven't, it should be popped up on your screen. Most of you are stressed about November, just like me. That is totally fine. And a lot of you guys in the Pacific Northwest, I'm stoked. And 100% of you know exactly who you're voting for. And I'm gonna assume it's Biden-Harris. I might be wrong, but I'm gonna make those assumptions and I feel pretty good about it. So you guys might have seen for the last several months, we have been in an interesting place. So we have seen protests across the United States fighting for racial justice. We have seen an unprecedented number of people murdered by the hands of police, people of color. There have been protests occurring across the country nonstop since George Floyd was murdered. Louisville has seen unstoppable protests and marches consistently for Breonna Taylor, and we haven't seen justice. And so a lot of states where those things haven't happened have also been taking to the streets, and one of those places has been nightly protests in Portland, Oregon. I know that there's a lot of people, I can see it on the chat right now, who are calling in from Portland specifically, and I implore you to like share your experiences with us as we have this conversation. So there have been over 90 days of consecutive protests happening in Portland, but Portland is an interesting place, and I'll let our speakers speak on that because of their position. So who we have with us today is Professor Alexander Reid Ross, who is a professor at Portland State University. He's actually a professor of geography, but he has been writing and he is an expert on fascist regimes and how they operate. And he has been someone who's been in the streets himself. So he's going to go ahead and give us a primer on everything that we need to know about what's happening in Portland and how it actually applies to the rest of the country, and why we should be paying attention to what's happening in Portland and what's happening with the protests that are going on across the state and with our current administration. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Professor Alexander Ross.
Hi, thank you very much for the introduction. So I was just filling out this survey trying to address whether I wanted to drink more alcohol or coffee, and I can't really make up my mind. But I was drinking water earlier, so I'm not wasted at this particular time. I know the video is like a little bit crazy backlit over here, so I hope that's not too bizarre. Anyway, so yeah, if anybody has any, thoughts about what to discuss or what you want to think about or whatever, just throw it in the chat and maybe just interrupt me if I'm rambling. I want to see if I can share the map that has been getting some attention recently. If I can share my screen. Yeah. So this is the map that I made. We're looking at Portland. And basically, I got into this one morning. Typical thing at 6:30 in the morning when you're like bugging out and you just feel like you've got to do something. And I to make a map for quite a while, like a few days, because I was seeing things happening in Philadelphia and Chicago and areas of California. And so finally I just was like, I'm going to do this, because if I do and things calm down, then whatever, you can make fun of me for being an alarmist, but like if I don't and it gets to this level and nobody's been really kind of like making this available for the public, then, we're going to have a lot of confusion and we're not really going to be able to understand what's going on all around us. It'll be like this kind of weird traditionalist space where you just expect some guys with guns to show up if you have a protest, and that's, not particularly safe analyzing what's happening. So I started doing this on June 2nd at about 6:30 in the morning, compiling basically a Twitter thread, and then every time I would find something, I would post it in the thread and then add it to a spreadsheet. And so I created this spreadsheet, which I'll show y'all here. And the spreadsheet was sort of just like built on the fly. I was just like, where did the incident happen? What county, what city, what state, what day did it happen? And then like brief description. And then increasingly I started to notice sort of like different kinds of incidents. And so I would just like code, okay, so like this was an incident of police collaboration. And I tried to keep those relatively sort of unique so that I can just sort through the spreadsheet right away and say, okay, how many assaults took place, and see right here, 31. And then obviously if there's more than one incident, more than one type, you have to add a second sort of code column. So you can say how many assaults here, 14. So what is that already? We're at more than, 40, almost 50, or around 50 assaults just from the first two columns. This is not the best way of doing a spreadsheet at all. I constructed this on the fly and deeply, deeply regret the way that it turned out. It's kind of useful, but it's also super clunky. Probably the best way would have been to explode and make this spreadsheet way bigger than it is, that there's a column for each, code, and you can count how many of the incidents took place in which of those codes or what have you. That might have been the easiest way of doing it, but similar with dates, right? So with dates, what I should have done is made it a much bigger spreadsheet with more dates options for more incidents, but instead I just kind of loaded up each column with however many you're going to get. So, I have regrets, but it is what it is. And you can see here, biggest incident magnet is Portland, Multnomah County, with 19 incidents. And then you have Lane County in Oregon. And so you start to see that there's clustering happening. So the incidents are getting clustered together. And the best way of showing that is, creating a map. And this was made quite easily with ArcGIS, not ArcGIS, with a free software called QGIS. I could actually show you how to do that if you're interested. I use QGIS 3.14, but it doesn't really matter because the QGIS platform is kind of diabolical. It's, I don't know, a pretty straightforward operation. You just sort of add your data, and then you join it to some kind of county file that you can download from the internet. And then you just throw it up on a map with a base map.
Hey, Alex, sorry to interrupt, but I'm James. I'm the communications director here at Women's March Action, and we had a question earlier in the chat that was kind of like a big picture baseline question that would be a super helpful way, I think, to get started of just defining fascism. Mary asked if you could just define fascism. And then I'm really interested in all this data, but I would love it if you could start with that kind of big picture definition of fascism and then how it's playing out on the streets that comes out in this data.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Sure. So I would say that the definition of fascism that I typically go with is associated with something called the new consensus, which is basically to say that you can define a generic form of fascism as palingenetic ultranationalism, which effectively means that it is a movement that believes in the rebirth of a kind of national spirit, both in kind of mystical terms like epic poetry or imperial history, and in more like ethnocentric terms, bound by a territory and like rooted in the soil and sort of functioning off of this assumption of the superiority of ancestral ties to more civic relationships developed through common principles. And that really that movement, has a specific origin, right, in Italy, but also through the kind of interconnections of the syndicalist left and anarchists on one hand, and also ultranationalists and elitist capitalists on the other hand, who kind of sort of bound their ideas together and created this syncretic, this kind of melding or fusion of nationalism and socialism together, really with this like hardcore patriarchal ideal as a sort of binding glue. So, for tenets of fascism, I would say they're incredibly patriarchal, they're ultra-nationalist, and they really support the use of impulsive violence, like violence in a sense that it doesn't need any reason or cause. It's just a force and a reason in and of itself. And so when you think about fascism in this context, I think that we're seeing a kind of interesting fusion between different fascist groups and radical right groups. Like in New Mexico, with the New Mexico Civil Defense, this New Mexico Civil Defense leader actually has a swastika tattoo, which he claims, you know, he just got that in prison because he was trying to protect himself. But other people say he's a committed Nazi, which, you know, as a guy who has a swastika tattoo is going to have to go a real long way to try to explain himself there. And one of his guys in his militia actually comes straight out of a fascist group and is now a Proud Boy. So what we're seeing within that paradigm is a whole fascinating synthesis of militia groups, which really kind of had their strong period of emergence in the 90s, and then after Obama was elected. On the one hand, we're also seeing just neo-Nazis joining these militia groups and sort of trying to tone down the rhetoric. And then we're also seeing these other kinds of weirder national revolutionary fascist groups whose...
So speaking of weirder, a couple of people asked in the comments if what the Bugaloos are.
Yeah.
And yeah. I feel like that's also a good opportunity for if you could just explain a little bit about like I heard you mention the synthesis of far right groups and fascist groups, and like what's the difference? You know what I mean? And Bugaloos are like a weird version that might be a good example to tell us the difference.
So the Bugaloos are really, really weird. I could start by noting that they came out of 4chan, which is an image board dedicated to absolutely appalling everybody who actually puts eyes on it. 4chan has a reputation since its inception as just being a place for miscreants to post extremely controversial stuff and get away with it with impunity. And it was sort of rated by, I mean, it was the beginning of really like this whole dark web of image boards, which then some of those developed into basically just purely fascist image boards. And they started to kind of raid 4chan and it sort of infiltrate 4chan. And they basically took over one of the image boards on 4chan called Pull. And so especially after Gamergate, when some women who were female journalists who were writing about misogyny in the gamer community were basically full on harassed and attacked, both online and physically. 4chan Pull became like a place for these guys to start organizing because, you know, they felt attacked as like gamers or whatever. And during that period, a lot of them just turned straight into fascists, and 4chan basically became a fascist image board on Pull. It's kind of being fought over right now, but because the dark web is so large at this point, especially with the COVID-19 stuff, it's been growing. There's more of opportunity for fascists to organize in different image boards and raid 4chan when they're being insufficiently fascist. So the Boogaloos came out of one of the image boards on 4chan, which is specifically dedicated to weapons. It's called K. And basically they use this term electric boogaloo, which is this kind of like, they're making fun of a movie called Breaking 2, Electric Boogaloo, which was just seen as like a really bad sequel to Breaking 1. It's like a breakdance movie. I disagree. It's an excellent film. Everybody should watch it. Breaking 2, Electric Boogaloo, if you like dance-offs, this is your movie. But so they would just like apply the name Electric Boogaloo to everything that was like part 2 and probably will suck. Like, you know, Clean the Sink to Electric Boogaloo or something like that. And so they started to apply it to American Civil War, Civil War II Electric Boogaloo or something like that, which in 4chan was sort of like committed to race war. And they kind of tried to tone that down and say, oh, it's not all about race war, it's just about a new civil war because we all hate liberals and we hate the liberal consensus and everything is terrible. And so Electric Boogaloo is going to be like this sort of like insurgent sectarian civil war, you know, where all the innocent people die and it's going to be all horrible, but let's bring it about, you know, because what we have now is terrible anyway. So they wanted to accelerate the civil war that they thought was coming about in real time. And
question, how do you plays out, because these originally started as fringe groups, you know, a lot of these folks started as fringe groups. How do you think this plays out for the election? How do you think, I mean, they have scare tactics, they're now out protesting, really creating some chaos. And so how do we see them affecting the election?
So I think that, I mean, the Boogaloo boys are, you know, basically just chaos actors at this point. You have like racist Boogaloo boys doxing anti-racist Boogaloo boys, and both of them want to bring about the civil war as soon as possible. So it's just mayhem. And if they are able to, you know, impact the election, may God have mercy on everybody, because all they want is social disintegration. You know, if they're able to impact the cycle, then the cycle won't exist. It won't have to, because everybody will be shooting at each other by then. The good thing about that is I don't think that they will, because they're sufficiently marginalized in what one might call the radical community. They weren't able to sort of like infiltrate to the degree that they would like to have. And so they are unable to instigate the degree of violence that they would like to instigate in order to accelerate violence within the context of these anti-racist protests. So that's the good news. The other issue, of course, is that actually it appears that at least one of these guys who was, you know, guarding a gas station in Kenosha was actually connected to the Boogaloo movement, or made some claims in that regard. And so also being a white nationalist. And so in that context, then they already have impacted the the course of sort of electoral politics, partly because they've sort of forced, I think, Biden to actually come out and sort of more strongly disavow violence in protests. And I think that they've also made they've shown true colors from a lot of people in the GOP who are escalating violent rhetoric, and who are absolutely supportive of this 17-year-old amateur vigilante who apparently murdered 2 people. So I think that there is like an escalatory fashion, like in this accelerationist sort of movement, where if Trump sort of founders in the election, they will try to pick more fights and be more brutal. But even outside of Trump, like in the Pacific Northwest at this point, groups like the Proud Boys are simply out for blood, and I think that they want to massively injure people and maybe kill them in Portland. So those kinds of groups are also going to have an impact. And I think it really depends on what independent voters, people who are not part of Trump's sort of core constituency, are going to decide, you know, whether they believe that Trump, who is just a career criminal, really can represent law and order, or whether they believe that, you know, Biden would represent a return to a better normal.
Right.
Let's jump into some other questions.
We have a few people, the chat's like lighting up, so we gotta get to questions because they're ready
I
to
prefer
come.
that. Yeah.
So Phyllis has had her hand up for a while, so I'll start with Phyllis, and then I'll go through the chat and see which questions we've got in there.
Phyllis, can we unmute you? There we go. Unmute.
Thank you both. Thank you all. I had so many questions, I'm not even sure which one popped up. I'll start with my first one, which is kind of where I see, as far as the election goes, like all of these texts and Facebook requests I'm getting for polling, I don't know where they're from, and I don't trust that they're from us, so I don't believe they're not from them. So my responding, absolutely not. So to that point, I have no confidence in the polls whatsoever because I don't feel I'm the only one. That was one thought. The last thought I had, and it's not really a thought, but more of a witch with a bee, is these groups that are creating this havoc. I'm sure 45 is totally on board with this because it further separates the right from the left, and then it leaves the left with whatever's left, if you will. And I'm feeling it's just a detriment to our entire political system to allow this to happen, but I'm afraid that I can't trust I don't want to say intelligence or education, but I'll say the belief of the United States citizens to truly understand what they're looking at and who they're looking at and vote accordingly. So I'm sorry, it was more event than a question. I had so many chats in there. I'm sorry. I am drinking water in addition. I promise I am. I'm so worried and so nervous, and I will back off now, but thank you for letting me speak.
Should we trust the polls? I don't think so, but what do you think?
I mean, that's always kind of a toss-up, right? I mean, polling we've seen that over-reliance on polling has made people overconfident in the past. And so I think that they can, I do believe that polls are useful, but they're not useful as predictors. They're useful as like taking the temperature. And I think it is also useful to average them out, like say, you know, the 538 models do. But at the same time, you lose a lot in that process because some polls are better than others, and a weighted system is not necessarily going to dig out the weird stuff in the data. So, yeah, I just think we have to okay, so to that kind of comment and then the question, I think like the accelerationist style is to bring about the disintegration of society. The whole point is to bring about social disintegration in order to promote a strong state of order, which people will then flock to as the new center. And so the most important thing is not to sit back and rely on polls and think we're doing okay and we're on course, but actually to create like networks of solidarity and to grow communities of resistance and to be to have integrity and to trust each other and to not and yeah, I'm worried and everything, but I also think that it's important not to be afraid.
Agreed. Agreed. We have a lot of questions. Let's see if.
So I said Sibel was going to be next. So I'll go ahead and unmute Sibel. And then after that, I have a question from Lisa. So Lisa, you'll be on deck when Sibel is finished. And I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly.
Sibel?
No, hi, you said it right. Thank you. Yeah, my question was really about, I mean, this entire thing is very alarming, full of anxiety, don't sleep much anymore. But the biggest question I have is, what do we do about it? How do we combat it? And I kind of think of it like a cult. Is it something that we can do to change the minds of these people? Because even if Biden wins, which I hope to God he does, we're going to be left with this broken nation. And there's so many people that I'm terrified of. So that's the question I have is, what can we do as a society, as a nation, as healers to change this trajectory? is there some psychological thing that can happen, some whatever healing we can do? And I don't know if anybody has the answer, but that's what I'm hoping to hear. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it a lot. I think that, you know, these kinds of times depend on our, you know, bonds of friendship, our ability to trust one another, and our own like safety. And so I think like the first thing we have to do before we try to do outreach and de-radicalization and that kind of stuff, which is its own whole field, is make sure that we ourselves are in a good state of mind, you know, and take care of ourselves, which is different for everybody. And it means in some cases that it's not like up to you to have to be that person all the time, you know, but I think, you know, there is a very serious political cult that it has been created partly by Trump and partly by his supporters and their interactions together. And how do you contend with, you know, people who are that far gone and engaged in conspiracy theories? I do think that stopping them from being able to circulate their message is pretty critical. You know, denying them the legitimacy of public platforms and making sure that every time disinformation is presented, it also has a counter argument and a debunking caveat. I'm thinking about this from the perspective of media, of course, but like in one-to-one, you know, relationships, I think, you know, I've talked to people who are like, how do I reach out to my teacher? You know, I myself have a brother who is kind of a little bit weird, but it's a big question. A lot of people don't want to hear, you know, so how do you reach out to them? And I think, like, I don't know, a big part of it for me is just making sure that our intentions are sound and that we ourselves have integrity and people can't challenge us on those grounds. So we feel strong in ourselves enough to be able to intervene when we can, from a place of compassion and empathy, and to leave off when we don't, when it's sort of unneeded and it's going to provoke a lot of reaction.
Right. I want to speak a little bit on that. I want to make sure that we really think about that these folks have always existed. They're not new. Trump did not create them. As a Latina growing up in Chicago in Black neighborhoods, these folks have existed. They are just a little bit braver. So it's going to take all of us to actually acknowledge that they've existed, confronted, and I'm not saying go out and fight them. What I'm saying is that they have existed. We've got to really work together to actually confront what's going on, because this is not new. These folks are just braver, and they have become really more prominent with the current administration. It's not just Trump. It's the current administration. Mitch McConnell, my goodness. Okay, let's open it up to more questions.
All right, looks like we've got Lisa Hyatt next. Lisa, I have you unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Alexander, for being here. One of the comments that I made in the chat, and just kind of, I grew up in a very white suburban area where I went to school with a lot of these guys, and a lot of them they're really just reactionaries. Like, they want attention. They want to be part and out there. And I think that Trump has used them as a distraction. There's a lot of things going on that we aren't paying attention to when we're paying attention to these radical groups that are, you know, like Emiliana just said, they've existed. I mean, I'm 50 years old. I went to high school with a lot of these guys, and they're still doing it, and they've raised sons that are doing it. And they're angry, they're bitter, they're losing the America that makes them, just by being white men, powerful, and that scares the crap out of them, because then they actually have to do something other than just being white men to be successful. And you know, Alexander, if you could speak to kind of that, I don't think these groups really have any more power than we give them, right? We give them the platform by I think this administration has given them a platform, and that's really where the problem is that the mainstream GOP has given them a platform in a way that they don't normally have. But they did in the 60s when, white people wanted to be heard, and they terrorized people and got away with it because it was what the establishment wanted to happen.
Well, I don't know about what the establishment wanted to happen in the 1960s. I definitely know that the Insurrection Act was invoked in order to force Southern states to integrate the schools. And as a result, some Southern states called into action a strategy of massive resistance, including riots and whatnot, against the National Guard. And in this case today, we're seeing kind of like a crazy inversion of that moment where the militias are calling for the president to invoke the Insurrection Act in order to send in the National Guard against cities that are deemed insufficiently subordinate to Trump specifically. And they're basically talking about subverting the entire democratic process through the instrumentalization of not only local police, but also federal police. And it is absolutely strongman tactics from an authoritarian, a liberal leader. To the first part of what you were talking about, you're absolutely correct. I mean, everybody knows these people from the 90s and from the 2000s. They didn't fight us because we marched against the Iraq War, but they would still call us names and scream at us or try to fight us anyway for whatever reason they wanted to pick out. It's just that those guys have been emboldened to political violence in this case. So the same chauvinism that has been displayed for decades and decades, like Emiliana was saying, is just out in the streets for political cause. And like you were saying, Lisa, this is also related to their felt sense of fear that's sort of imbued in that racist ignorance, that they're actually losing their traditional ways and they're losing their hegemony, especially in the suburbs. Some of the data that I ran about demographic information surprised me because the demographics of places where incidents are taking place of intimidation, harassment, violence are actually just a little bit higher household income, a little bit more diverse, and a little bit younger than the straight median of counties in the United States. And I was like, why does that work? How does that work? That doesn't make sense because it's not correlated to it's not correlated to population density. So I'm not just mapping population. There is something going on here. And I've tried to think about it, and I think it's because we've seen articles in the past that data shows that suburbs are becoming more diverse, they're becoming younger, and that, like you're saying, the older white men, the chauvinists are feeling threatened. And so they're the ones who are coming out and they're resisting this young movement, maybe the biggest movement in American history. I feel like Trump now, maybe the biggest movement in American history, but no, it is the biggest movement in American history, maybe. And they're the ones who are weak, and they're the ones who are put on their back foot, and they're the ones who are coming out with their assault rifles because they feel intimidated by a bunch of teenagers. And it's weakness and it's sad. But I think that it shows that we have significant opportunity to have power if we don't sort of play their game and descend into some kind of insane insurgency.
I wanted to back it up just a little bit and have you clarify something. We, talk about how they have this platform online, but they've actually come into very much the physical world, especially with what's happened in Portland recently. And I wanted to understand what you meant by incidents in the very beginning, like when you said there's incidents that have been happening. And then I want to give it to Aurora, who's had her hand up for a really long time. So if you could quickly just clarify what that meant.
Yeah, absolutely. So I look at incidents as like a discrete point in time where an act of intimidation or harassment, threats and violence, such as assaults, such as vehicular ramming attacks, and also incidents of police collaboration with organizations or individuals who are intimidating or assaulting protesters. And in some cases, several incidents happen over the course of one day. I think, for example, the caravan that went through Portland on Saturday probably had about 3 incidents just in that one period, because there were incidents of harassing counter protesters and intimidating them while they were still in the parking lot. And then they came over to Portland, they started to try to ram people. And then there was another incident where they were shooting people with paintball guns and spraying pepper spray out of a moving vehicle. And so I counted those sort of separately because I see them as separated from one another. Whereas if somebody is in a sort of like militia situation going out on a night patrol and is supported by the police, I might count that as like 1 incident or maybe 2 incidents, given like there's police collaboration on one hand and there's a patrol on the other hand, right? So in a way, doing this is quite conservative in that regard, because it's not like, how many people did that person like intimidate while they were like, okay, there was this episode of intimidation where they were on, 5th and Multnomah, and then there was another, when they were 3 blocks down or something like that. But at that point, you kind of have to just sort of like stop trying to capture all the complexity and just be able to, boil things down to a relatively simple data set.
Right. Okay, thank you so much for that. And then Aurora, you're unmuted.
It was along the lines of the same question. I was wondering, I'm over here in Los Angeles and have been involved with the some of the resistance to to trying to adopt the people's budget, and also trying to bring about the reform in the way we police. Mm-hmm. How much of the rise of these movements is fueled by that push, by that movement? Because I think since I was, a teenager or even growing up, I don't think there's been such a great voice coming, especially from women of color leaders that have formed Black Lives Matter, LA Justice, and I'm just speaking in Los Angeles, but nationwide. This whole conversation about how how communities are policed and how much of our budget goes to policing instead of other areas in the community. So do you see a correlation with the rise of that in correlation with what you're seeing?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I mean, I saw also, there was rising threats and stuff happening during 2014, right? Like around Black Lives Matter groups in Portland. But the extent was nowhere near this, as far as I know. I think you'd have to go way further back to ever come to a time when there was so much threat of violence against protesters in the United States. Certainly nothing in my lifetime. And yeah, I mean, with LA, it's really fascinating. There's like, I don't know, there's like Tahunga, the neighborhood, is just seeing just a huge amount of violence from counter protesters there. And on top of that, you have this story about the executioners gang, like a police gang that has some kinds of politics around killing people, based in South Central, and this shooting that just happened yesterday. So, I mean, I love LA, and I know that people will turn out, and that there's a lot of great movement there. But there's also, just like San Diego County, there's all those weird neighborhoods where people are highly reactionary, and like, Defend East County in San Diego is also like a really big group right now that is terrorizing people. So
I'll clarify. I think for LA, we have a lot of groups that come in from Ventura County, from Tahunga. This weekend, we had a Trump parade on Ventura Boulevard where someone was actually shot, like someone shot at them through a window. It looked like a parade, and before you knew it, all the Trump flags came out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, we were shocked that Sherman Oaks actually approved a permit that some of these people had weapons. So I think they're coming from outside of just the district. I think that they sent us an email at Women's March, like, our march is going to be bigger. We were like, what? You're having a march? But I do think they come out from other areas to intimidate the Black Lives Matter movement, because who is leading the Black Lives Matter movement is really women. Mm-hmm. Lena Abdullah, Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza. You are talking about intimidation and misogynistic behavior. It's really going on.
Precisely. Yeah.
All right. So it looks like we've got a question from Ellen Winters Miller. She's been waiting a while. So Ellen, got you unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you. So it's actually me. I'm her son, Danny. Okay. So you kind of answered it in some ways, my initial question, but I'm also just curious, knowing that you study the topic, if you could recall any instances throughout history where there has been conflict like this, where the governing body has used use of force on its own citizens. And I'm asking that more so to see if there are any lessons we can glean from those times to try and counteract them. If we can recognize what's going on as something that's previously happened, are there ways that we can, organize and activate people so the end results aren't the same as they have been historically?
Right. I mean, I think, first and foremost, it's so deeply embedded in US history to have these sort of racist vigilantes trying to basically carve out policy and being pretty successful at it. You can look in the history of the Pacific Northwest, for example, with anti-Chinese groups that ended up being able to pass through the Chinese Exclusion Act. And all of the Klan manifestations from the 1860s to the 1920s to the 1960s and then to the 70s. The Klan is just like embedded in American, the mythos of American nationalism, and so is vigilantism in general. And I think, when you look at the interwar fascist groups in the United States, you have the Silver Shirts and other groups that were trying to draw on that history and create like the Committee of 1,000. They had all of those kind of like vigilance committee of 10,000 or whatever. It was usually just like 50 people meeting for beers and calling themselves weird names, but so that kind of like came out through the post-war period as the anti-government sort of posse comitatus movement that emerged in the early 1970s, incredibly anti-Semitic, the forebears of the militia movement, which actually, from the late 1970s on through, especially through the Mormon cultural region and sovereign citizens and the Pacific Northwest, the interior Northwest, like Montana, these groups got a lot of clout in local offices, like in like sheriff's departments, in sort of like county commissioners, and also with corporations who wanted to use them to stop environmental movement. So in the United States, we already have like this long history and trajectory, which tends to be on the part of the vigilantes. They tend to defeat themselves often. You look at how the second version of the Klan died, and you know, I don't even want to talk about it. It's so disgusting. Those people were awful, awful people. But you know, most of these groups, these militia groups, are just pyramid schemes. And so they end up fighting over each other for capital and for clout and all that kind of stuff. And so they can be also dismantled through a number of different means. Spencer Sunshine just published an interesting manual on like different strategies and tactics to legally help dismantle racist organizations. He did that with Pop Mob, which is a Portland-based group. And to the history question, I mean, there's so many examples of just like these kinds of lingering, protracted struggles, from the Lebanese Civil War to Ulster in the 1970s, to Weimar Germany is probably the most cited example of protracted political conflict between organized political sort of paramilitary forces, leading to the decline and disintegration of the democratic Republican state or parliamentary system, and bringing about a kind of opportunistic rise of Nazism through capitulations and egoism and compromise with basically the military establishment and the center right. So in order to stop that from happening specifically, my opinion is we have to get between the center right and the far right and make sure that we keep the far right at bay and continue to expose them in every way humanly possible as, you know, terrible human beings that nobody would benefit from associating with. And unfortunately, that's been, I don't want to say a losing battle, but an uphill battle for sure in the Trump era. But it's no less decent to maintain pressure on conservatives to abandon hostile actors that will intend to bring about the complete collapse of democracy and even the principles underlying it.
I think we have time for a few more questions. I think our next one was Douglas Hall. Yeah. There we go.
Hey, good evening. How's everybody?
Hi, good.
Excellent, excellent. Checking in from DC, as a matter of fact. Ground zero, if you will. My concern, well, one of my concerns was the manipulation of the federal judiciary by Trump in the Senate. And we've already seen a couple of elections go straight to the Supreme Court. So leery that this whole process is going to tighten up over the next couple of months, and we might be seeing a replay. Any comments?
I mean, it's true, and that is worrying. But you know, that's why I'm hoping that we get a better turnout this time around, because I think more people today recognize the crisis that Trump really represents. I mean, I remember arguing with people in 2016 who were absolutely insisting that Trump wouldn't win because the ruling class didn't want him to win. You know, I was like, he's got billions of dollars. I don't know what your class analysis would say about that. I remember talking to people who said, you know, Hillary would be worse than Trump because Trump was going to end our forever wars. You know, and I just, you know, remember thinking like, he's pretty bellicose nationalists. They don't tend to be a peaceable type. But I'm not seeing those people coming around anymore. I'm thinking like the the left, such as it remains, is more committed today to restoring some kind of norm of democracy than we saw in 2016. And I hope that will turn the tide in a lot of the northern states where you have, left liberals and progressives who maybe couldn't, come around to supporting the Democrats, but will this time around because of, I think, a big one is just the abject failure with regards to COVID-19. So I suppose I'm hopeful. I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful, and I think it's worth trying.
I would say, to Douglas, I would say that we need to deliver the Senate, because if Mr. Biden and Harris was carrying the ticket, my personal opinion, if they were to win and don't have a Senate to work with, we're in trouble. We're in trouble again. And I wish that the Democrats would start working on a long-term plan. The stacking of the courts did not happen overnight. This was 10, 12 years of stacking of courts and being ready for that successor, which was Trump. Every one of them said no, they did not want Trump. But when they knew that this person had the charisma to bring in these people, they backed him. But they knew that on the back end for 10, 12 years, they had stacked the courts. So they knew that no matter what happened, they had supporters. So I think that we need to really keep our eye on the Senate. We need to keep our eye on the House, and of course the presidential race, but that's not the end all. I think when we talk about courts, we really need to get a plan going to make sure that we are ready to, yes, take the White House, but the courts as well. I mean, I'm lighting a candle every day for RBG. I mean, this is no way to live. So I'm just saying this is what we need to do to really heal the nation as well. To, yes, take the White House, but the healing of the nation is what's going to take a decade at least. So I'll say that. And I think we have time for one more question and then my music.
Okay, I think we can go to Eleonora. She's been waiting for a little while. But just real quick, yes, we've got to get the Senate, because you guys remember what happened to Obama. He was blocked at every single thing he put forth. So Senate is just as important, if not more important. So Eleonora, you are unmuted.
Yeah, I'm wondering, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm wondering, since these people are showing up with assault weapons at these protests, why, and their aim is to start some kind of a war, why haven't we seen it play out yet?
Well, because they're not that smart, but go ahead, Alexander.
That's part of it. It's not everybody who's coming out with assault rifles to start a war. A lot of them are just trying to intimidate the left into going back into their homes, and reading the Bible. It's also for them, I think, about having an opportunity to go out and flex, to be somebody who is macho and big and strong and stuff like that. There's a small fringe component, like Emiliana was saying, of people who are trying to escalate and accelerate some kind of civil war. And they haven't been successful because people were already successful at exposing them. There's a website called Bellingcat that did a really great article about them right away, showing that they're basically just entryists, infiltrators, effectively. Whether or not they're like, I'm a right winger or I'm a left winger or whatever, they're still what they are, which is like keep them away. So yeah, that strategy kind of failed for them. Even when they tried to accelerate violence in Vegas, they were actually arrested and people found out about what they were doing and roundly condemned them. So, you know, a lot of that is just about protesters using their common sense successfully, and making sure to stay on message and not to get carried away with, you know, just sort of violence for its own sake. That's what the right has been trying to do, and it's not what we're about.
That's right. Okay, with that, I think we're going to close the program. I'm going to close the program with every single woman had a child and these men, and we can take them out in 2020. That's what I'm going to say. Welcome them all out in 2020. Alexander, thank you. Sophia, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to remind everybody that you do have the opportunity to volunteer with us and to actually make real tangible change in this election. We are texting 250,000 women every single week. We are making phone calls into critical swing states that we can flip. And we are truly, we have the power to make the difference. Women have been voting at higher rates than men since 1964. And if women could turn out 3 other people to vote alongside them, we will win this election with ease. So that will take all of your efforts, including mine. So I will be on a lot of those calls, and I'm happy to walk you through anything to be able to get you on the phones, text banking, phone banking, postcarding, whatever it is, find your lane and do it. The links have been dropped in the chat, and watch out for the follow-up email. Thank you everyone so much for joining. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you all so you can say goodbye. Thank you so much, Alex.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Great.
Put your boots on.
Diane, let's get together.
Woo! All right, thank you guys.
Thank you. Put your boots on.
See you in a minute.
Thank you, Alexander.
Woo.
Thank you.
Good night.
LA, y'all beat us in the playoff.
Yeah.
Good night, all.
All right. Take care.
Cheers. Appreciate the forum. Thank you.
Love you, Douglas. Thank you.
Hi, Douglas. Thank you so much.
Hey, appreciate it. See you next week.
Hi, Mom. Bye, Mom.